By the third night, the cold had already started killing people. Not with violence, not with war, but slowly, quietly, like something creeping through the cracks of every home. In many villages, families stopped burying the dead because the ground had frozen solid. Axes could not break it. Shovels bounced off the earth like stone. Some bodies stayed inside homes for days beside weak candlelight, while snow piled against the doors outside. And nobody understood why this was happening. The sky looked wrong. The sun looked weak. Summer had disappeared. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, crops began dying one after another. Wheat failed. Corn failed. Rice fields flooded. Animals collapsed from hunger. And millions of people slowly realized the world was changing around them. It began in 1815, far away from Europe, far away from America, on a remote island in Indonesia. There stood a giant volcano called Mount Tambora. For centuries, it had slept silently above villages and forests. Then one night, the mountain exploded. The blast was so powerful that people over 1,000 miles away heard it like cannon fire. The top of the mountain collapsed into itself. Rivers of fire rushed through villages. Ash covered the sky. Entire communities disappeared beneath smoke and burning rock. But the true disaster did not stay in Indonesia. It spread across the planet. Massive clouds of ash climbed high into the atmosphere, where winds carried them around the earth. At first, nobody connected the strange weather to the volcano. Life continued normally. Farmers planted crops. Markets stayed open. Children played in muddy streets. But slowly, temperatures began falling. Then came the year 1816, the year history would remember as the year without summer. In June, snow fell across parts of New England in America. People woke up expecting warm weather. Instead, they found frozen fields. Farmers watched helplessly as ice destroyed crops overnight. In some places, rivers froze during months that were supposed to be warm. Birds disappeared from the sky. Livestock starved because grass could no longer grow properly. Families burned firewood in the middle of summer just to stay alive. And this was not happening in one country. It was happening everywhere. Across Europe, endless cold rain soaked farmland for weeks. Nothing dried. Nothing ripened. Fields turned into mud. Potatoes rotted underground. Wheat harvests collapsed. The sky stayed covered in thick gray clouds that blocked sunlight for days at a time. People became frightened, not only because of hunger, but because nature itself no longer made sense. Many believed God was punishing humanity. Churches filled with desperate families praying for the cold to end. Others believed the world was entering the apocalypse. And honestly, for ordinary people living through it, it probably felt that way. Back then, most families survived from one harvest to the next. There were no massive food reserves, no international aid, no modern transportation bringing supplies from across the world. If crops failed, people starved. And that is exactly what began happening. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. Soon, ordinary workers could no longer afford basic food. Families started eating less each day. Parents skipped meals so children could survive a little longer. Some people boiled weeds into soup. Others crushed tree bark and mixed it with flour to make rough black bread. In poorer regions, people hunted rats and stray animals. Anything that could stop the pain of hunger. But hunger changes the human mind. At first, people share. Then fear grows. Then desperation begins. Across France and parts of England, angry crowds attacked food markets. Grain wagons traveling between towns were sometimes robbed before reaching their destination. In Switzerland, riots broke out as starving people demanded bread. Everywhere, rumors spread faster than truth. Some blamed governments. Some blamed merchants. Some blamed foreigners. Human beings always search for someone to blame when survival begins slipping away. But no government could stop the weather. No king could command crops to grow. And the cold kept coming. Again, and again, and again. The skies themselves became terrifying. Because of the volcanic ash still floating high above Earth, sunsets turned deep red and orange. In some places, the sun appeared as a strange, glowing circle behind the haze. People stared upward in fear. It looked unnatural, like the world itself had become sick. Meanwhile, disease spread rapidly through starving populations. Typhus, dysentery, fever. When a human body weakens from hunger, even a small illness becomes deadly. Entire villages fell silent, not because everyone had died, but because people no longer had the energy to work or even speak. Parents watched children grow thinner each week. Farm animals collapsed in field from lack of food. Horses died beside frozen roads. The smell of sickness spread through crowded towns. And then came winter, the real nightmare. Temperatures dropped even lower. Snowstorms buried roads for days. Food reserves disappeared completely in some regions. Thousands of desperate people left their homes searching for survival somewhere else. Roads filled with wandering families carrying whatever they still owned. Blankets, cooking pots, weak children wrapped in old coats. Some never reached another town. Some froze beside the road during storms. Others disappeared into forests searching for shelter and were never seen again. In China, failed harvests caused terrible famine in several provinces. Reports described starving people eating roots, leaves, insects, even mud mixed with water just to fill their stomachs. Across parts of Europe, people became so weak from hunger that they could barely stand. And perhaps the worst part of all was the uncertainty. Nobody knew when it would end. Every morning people looked at the sky, hoping for warmth. Instead, they saw more clouds, more frost, more rain. Then finally, winter passed, or at least people thought it had. When spring arrived, survivors prayed that life would return to normal. Farmers planted seeds again. Families held on to hope. But then the cold returned. Snow fell again in late spring across several regions. Fresh crops died once more. That was the moment many people emotionally broke. Because surviving one terrible winter is possible. But surviving endless uncertainty is something different. Hope itself began disappearing. Still, human beings adapted. Communities shared food when governments failed. Neighbors took in orphaned children. Fishermen risked deadly storms to bring food back to starving villages. Some farmers changed the crops they planted, searching for foods that could survive colder temperatures. People learned to endure because survival is not always about strength. Sometimes survival means waking up one more day even when everything around you feels hopeless. For nearly 2 years, the planet lived beneath the shadow of Tambora. Millions suffered. Many died anonymously, not in battle, not from invasion, but from cold, from hunger, from a planet suddenly thrown out of balance. And perhaps the most frightening part was how powerless humanity truly was. One volcano, one eruption, and the entire world changed. Even culture changed because of it. During those dark, storm-filled months in Switzerland, a group of writers stayed trapped indoors beside a lake because the weather outside was so terrible. One of them was a young woman named Mary Shelley. Surrounded by darkness, storms, and endless cold, she began writing a story about death and creation. That story became Frankenstein. Even art carried the scars of that terrible winter. Eventually, the ash in the atmosphere slowly faded. Sunlight returned. Temperatures slowly improved. Harvests began growing again. The world survived. But survivors never forgot what they had seen. They never forgot summer snowstorms, or frozen crops, or empty markets, or the sound of hungry people begging for bread in the streets. The year without summer became one of the strangest climate disasters in human history. And today, most people have never even heard of it. But for those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Because civilization feels strong when life is normal. Cities grow. Markets stay full. People believe tomorrow will always come. But history reminds us how fragile everything really is. A single eruption, a darkened sky, a colder summer, and suddenly millions of lives begin collapsing one by one. The cold eventually faded. The world recovered. But the fear remained. Because humanity learned something terrifying during those years. Nature does not negotiate. And sometimes, survival is the only thing left that matters.